Good evening. I'm Steve Crouch, Dean of the College of Science and Engineering at the University of Minnesota. On behalf of the university, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. The lecture is part of the Mathematics of Planet Earth 2013 public lecture series made possible by the Simons Foundation. Tonight's lecture is the 8th in a series of 9 Simons lectures held at different locations around the world. We are honored that our Institute for Mathematics and its Applications, the IMA, has been chosen to host this important event. During the past several years, the College of Science and Engineering has made special efforts to promote mathematics, science, and engineering to the general public through lectures such as the one you'll hear tonight. In this regard, I especially want to welcome our visitors from outside the university. We're happy you could join us this evening. The IMA has been supported by the National Science Foundation for more than 30 years. During this time, we've been privileged to have distinguished mathematicians from all over the world come and share their excitement of their field with us. Tonight's lecture is a continuation of that activity. I would now like to ask Professor Fadil Santosa, Professor of Mathematics and Director of the IMA, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. Welcome, everyone. I just want to say a few words about Martin Nowak. Martin is Professor of Biology and Mathematics at Harvard University and Director of a program called Evolutionary Dynamics. He received his PhD degree in 1989 from the University of Vienna. From there, he went to Oxford as the Erwin Schrödinger Scholar. He became the head of the Mathematical Biology Group at Oxford University in 1995 and Professor of Mathematical Biology in 1997. In 1998, he moved to Princeton to establish the first program in theoretical biology at the Institute for Advanced Study. And he has been at his present position at Harvard since 2003. Professor Nowak works on mathematical descriptions of evolutionary processes, including the evolution of cooperation and human language, as well as the dynamics of virus, infections, and human cancer. He has received many awards for his groundbreaking research. They include the 1990 Prize from the Austrian Science Minister, the 1996 Weldon Memorial Prize, the 1999 Akira Okubo Prize given by the Society for Mathematical Biology, the Roger Murray Prize by the Institute for Quantitative Research in Finance. He has interest in many areas of mathematics and its applications. And in 2001, the David Starr Jordan Prize. This prize recognizes young scientists who contribute in innovative ways to one or more fields in David Starr Jordan's interests: evolution, ecology, population, and organismal biology. Sorry about that. He's a member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences and a recipient of an honorary degree from the ICUSA University in Iași in Romania. He's author of 4 books, including the award-winning book entitled Evolutionary Dynamics, and over 350 research papers. His most recent book is entitled SuperCooperators: Why We Need Each Other to Succeed. The topic of his lecture tonight is drawn from this book. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Professor Martin Nowak.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. It's a great joy and honor for me to be here. I'm a mathematical biologist, and before I begin, I would like to tell you a little story what that means in everyday life. So there's a shepherd and a flock of sheep, and a man comes by and says, "If I guess the correct number of sheep in your flock, can I have one?" And the shepherd says, "Okay, try." So the man looks around and says, 83. The shepherd is amazed because it's the right number. So he picks up a sheep and wants to walk away. Then the shepherd says, "Hang on, if I guess your profession, can I have my sheep back?" "Okay, please try." "You must be a mathematical biologist." "How did you know?" "Because you picked up my dog." So you realize that in our field, it's about getting the numbers right, and I hope tonight we will get the numbers right in evolution of cooperation. you also realize that even though I have been away for many, many years from my native Austria, I never lost the accent. And my students in Oxford told me that I speak like Arnold Schwarzenegger. So the title of my talk is Evolution of Cooperation, and here you see 3 examples of cooperation. The one example, as it existed at the dawn of life, some 3 billion years ago, a bacteria that form filaments, and every so often a cell dies in order to feed the others with nitrogen. So the question would be, why does evolution build an individual that gives up its life in order to feed the others? Then in the middle of the picture, you see an example that arose 125 million years ago with social insects. And here the question would be, why do workers not reproduce themselves, but they help another individual reproduce? And finally, an example from our own time scale, a painting of Vincent van Gogh of the Good Samaritan. People help each other. So here's another example of impressive kind of cooperation or altruism. As the Fukushima power plant was melting down, a worker in his 20s was among those who volunteered to re-enter. And he knew there were terrible health consequences, which might even prevent him from marrying or having children for fear of burdening them with genetic diseases. But when he was interviewed, he said, "There are only some of us who can do this job. I'm single and young, and I feel it's my duty to help settle this problem." So we have to ask ourselves, why is there cooperative, altruistic action among people? Why is it so abundant in nature? There are only a few dates that I want all of my students to remember that are sort of truly important, where the truly amazing things have happened. And so the first one, the beginning of everything, the Big Bang, how old is the universe? You can ask your colleagues, the physicists, and they will tell you 13.7 billion years. 3 different calculations point to more or less the same answer. You can also ask the physicists, how old is the sun? How old is our own solar system? And they can give you very precise numbers. But then you move to biology, and the numbers are no longer so certain. So we know, or most people believe, there was an origin of life on this planet, and this origin of life could have taken place about 4 billion years ago. What we know with some degree of certainty is that 3.5 billion years ago, there's clear chemical evidence for life on Earth. So there were such bacteria, as I showed in my first slide, that gave rise to chemical changes in the rocks that can be observed and clearly documented. But bacterial fossils exist only from 2.1 billion years ago. The eukarya, the higher cells, 1.8 billion years ago. And complex multicellularity, 600 million years ago. Ever since I worked with Ed Wilson, I also put social insects in this scale of big events in evolution because the superorganism of social insects is a distinct form of biological organization. And that came about around 120 million years ago. If you say, what's the most important thing that happened in the last 120 million years or so, there's only one thing to mention, and this is the evolution of human language. Of order of time scale, 1 million years ago. And why do I put it there? Because it's the invention of a new mode of evolution. Prior to human language, evolution was restricted to the transfer of genetic information to the largest extent. With human language, we suddenly have another mode where evolutionary processes can take place in kind of communications between people. And that's really the explanation why the human species is so amazingly adaptive in an ecological sense, for the better or for the worst. So inventing a new mode of evolution. I would argue bacteria invent almost all of biochemistry. Eukarya invent complicated genetics, later complex multicellularity, the immune system, the nervous system. Humans invented language and therefore a new mode of evolution. And what fascinates me very much as a biologist about these major steps, major transitions in evolution is really the realization that at all of them, cooperation is crucially involved. So whenever biology, evolution goes from one level of organization to a higher level of organization, it is based on cooperation. Cooperation is a kind of master architect in the evolutionary process. For example, single-cellular organisms start to cooperate among cells and then form multicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms are based on cooperation among cells, where they don't just replicate, but they do what is needed for the organisms. Cancer is a breakdown of cooperation among cells in a multicellular organism. And human society, to a very large extent, is built on this successful cooperation between people, locally and in bigger institutions, and more recently on global scales. So what I want to say is that cooperation is really needed for construction. It's a third fundamental principle of evolution. So talking about evolution, the first question that we have to ask is, what is it that evolves? And this question was beautifully posed by Ernst Mayr, a Harvard biologist who lived to be more than 100 years. He said, what is it that evolves? His own field was evolution of species. He said, loosely speaking, we talk about evolution of species, evolution of genes, evolution of the brain. None of these things actually evolve. The only carrier of the evolutionary process is the population of reproducing individuals. Then mutation is the very simple idea that a new form emerges, a new genetic variant emerges, either during reproduction, the typical course, or independent of reproduction. And then selection is the idea that different variants grow at different rates, and you get new forms emerging over time. And then cooperation is the idea that units start to work with each other, and they become closer and closer embedded until they form a higher unit of organization, and then evolution has moved from single-cellular organisms, say, to multicellular organisms. So cooperation here is the architect of complexity that we see in the world around us. So what is cooperation? In a simple game theoretic sense, there's an interaction between two units, cells or people, and one of them can cooperate, and the donor then pays a cost, C, and the recipient gets a benefit, B. So cooperation means I pay a cost and you have a benefit. And this cost and benefit are measured in terms of reproductive success, fitness. And this reproduction can be genetic or cultural. So in many human contexts, the reproduction is based in learning strategies, learning new ideas. And then the imitation of the successful strategies based on the success of the people that use them. So this simple interaction between donor and recipient leads to a game if we think of two people, both have the choice to cooperate or defect. And that's the famous prisoner's dilemma. And here I'm not going to explain the name, where the name comes from, because it's almost irrelevant, but I want to play with you this simple game. And so this is what is written here is the payoff matrix. And so here's the payoff matrix of the prisoner's dilemma, and we both have the option to cooperate or defect. And cooperation means paying a cost for the other person to get a benefit. So if I cooperate and you cooperate, then your payoff is B minus C. Because you have the cost for your cooperation, but you have the benefit because I cooperate. But if I defect and you cooperate, you don't get any benefit, you only have the cost. And if I cooperate and you defect, then you have no cost, only the benefit. And if we both defect, there's no exchange and you get zero. So benefit is greater than cost is greater than zero, and that's the payoff matrix of the prisoner's dilemma. And I want to ask you now to look at this and then make your choice between cooperation and defection, given these rules of the game, in the interaction with me. So who wants to cooperate with me? Please raise your hand. Who wants to defect? So many people are undecided. I should say it's not an optional game. We also have optional games in game theory, and then there would be a third column here, and then it would be do nothing, and that's a so-called relaxed social dilemma. This is like to opt out. So here you have to make a choice between cooperation and defection, especially those of you who take this class for credit. We will decide the credit how well you do in this game. So who wants to cooperate with me? Please raise your hand. Who wants to defect? So it's, I would say, half-half. So it's a pretty cooperative society, so that's congratulations for the dean. So many of these experiments show about 1/3 cooperation, roughly, I would say 1/2 cooperation. So this is how to analyze the game. You don't know what I will do. Assume I will cooperate. Let's assume I will cooperate. If I cooperate, you have a choice between B minus C and B. what is better? B. B is better. So if I cooperate, it's better for you to defect. If I defect, you have a choice between minus C and 0, and 0 is better than minus C. So if I defect, it's better for you to defect. If I analyze the game in the same way, we both end up with defection here, and now we are unhappy because we could have had more had we both cooperated. So the rational outcome is to defect in the prisoner's dilemma, but that doesn't really give us the socially optimum payoff. The Nash equilibrium is defection, but somehow it's not what we want, but there doesn't seem to be a way out. No matter what you do, it's better for me to defect. No matter what I do, it's better for you to defect. Therefore, we both defect. And that's the dilemma. So two rational players, and rational in a very narrow-minded sense of game theory here, invented by John von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern, two rational players defect and end up with a low payoff. So a rational player is somebody who looks at the matrix and then picks the Nash equilibrium in some sense, does the argument that I presented. But two irrational players might cooperate and receive a higher payoff, B minus C, and everybody would be happier. That's the dilemma. That's why it's called a dilemma. And the question is how to resolve the dilemma. So already some of you wanted to cooperate here. That's good. And during the talk, I think we will discover the reason why people want to cooperate in this game. But before I go there, I want to say that the analysis based on rationality is not really the only one that explains the game, and especially not the one that is used in biology. In biology, we just imagine a population of cooperators and defectors, and they bump into each other randomly. And what you can easily calculate is that on average, defectors have a higher payoff than cooperators. And therefore, defectors reproduce, they leave more offspring, therefore you get more defectors and less cooperators, and in the end you have just defectors. So natural selection wipes out cooperators and defectors accumulate. This is an interesting example where natural selection destroys the average fitness of the population. It reduces the average fitness of the population because it helps defectors to win over cooperators. Nevertheless, cooperation is abundant in nature, and therefore we want to understand how natural selection could actually lead to cooperation. And in particular, we want to discover mechanisms that might help natural selection to favor cooperation over defection. So natural selection needs help to favor cooperation over defection, and this help is given in mechanisms, and I will discuss 5 mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation, and they're called direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, spatial selection, group selection, kin selection. So what I have observed during my work is that there are many thousands of papers in this field, and they can be summarized. They all try to solve this problem of cooperation and defection, and they can be summarized into these 5 mechanisms. And these are the mechanisms I want to discuss. So direct reciprocity is the idea, I help you and you help me. And maybe there's a lot of the basic intuition that people have when playing the prisoner's dilemma, and maybe some of you cooperated because that's the intuition they have from everyday life. So what does this mean? This means we play the game not once, but several times. So you interact with people typically more than just once. So this leads to the so-called repeated prisoner's dilemma. And in the repeated prisoner's dilemma, it is no longer the case that the best thing and the only thing to do is to defect. Because if I defect now, I destroy the possible collaborative interaction I have with you. But if I cooperate now, I might induce you to cooperate in the future. So cooperation is an option in the repeated game. And there's a theorem that economists know, the so-called Folks theorem, that if the game is sufficiently often repeated, cooperation or other mixed strategies become an equilibrium. The Folks theorem does not tell you how to play the game. So the question, how to play the game, was asked by a political scientist, Robert Axelrod, in the late 70s at Ann Arbor University in Michigan. And he said, let's have computer tournament to play the repeated prisoner's dilemma. You send me strategies, and I will have them play against each other, and we will see who wins. So in his first tournament, he got 14 strategies, and some of them were smart. They tried to use Bayesian statistics to predict the behavior of the opponent. They tried to use deception. The surprise was that the simplest of all strategies won. And the simple strategy was just a 2 or 3 line program, and it was submitted by a Russian-Canadian game theorist who had thought deeply about the prisoner's dilemma, Anatol Rapoport, and his winning strategy was the following, tit for tat. I start with cooperation. If you cooperate, I will cooperate in the next round. If you defect, I will defect in the next round. So whatever you do, I will do in the next round, but I start with cooperation. And it was surprising that the simplest of all strategies won. And Axelrod published the outcome of the first tournament and then had the great idea, let's have a second tournament. And now people really paid even more attention and they submitted altogether 63 strategies. And all of them, or many of them, were designed to be better than tit for tat. Only one person submitted tit for tat again, Rapoport, and tit for tat won again. So tit for tat was also the winner of the second tournament. And then tit for tat was the undisputed world champion in the repeated prisoner's dilemma. It's how to play the repeated prisoner's dilemma. And Axelrod wrote a book which became a bestseller. And thousands of papers appeared, and tit for tat was discovered everywhere, in bats, in fish, in students. Everybody played tit for tat in experiments. There is, however, a weakness of tit for tat, an Achilles heel of our hero, and this is that it's too unforgiving. If there is a mistake, and economists call these mistakes trembling hands or fuzzy minds, then the other person will hit back, and then I will hit back, and then you will hit back. So we go into a kind of vendetta. And in a long run, 2 tit for tat players get a very low average payoff. Noise was not featured in Axelrod's tournament, so this weakness of tit for tat wasn't explored in them. It didn't become obvious in those tournaments. So when I started my PhD thesis with Carl Sigmund in Vienna, this was our idea. Instead of having design strategies play against each other, we wanted natural selection and mutation, generate strategies that play the game against each other. So we want natural selection to come up with good strategies and to study evolutionary dynamics of the repeated prisoner's dilemma. We start with a random ensemble of strategies where people just play randomly, and out of this, the first winner was always defect. So if the opposition is disorganized, the best thing to do is just to defect. But fortunately for my PhD thesis, this was not the end. What came next was, suddenly, tit for tat emerged. And you can actually prove mathematically that tit for tat is a very good catalyst, that in a society where many people defect, tit for tat is somehow a good way to start simple cooperation going. But again, fortunately for the thesis, it didn't end here because that would have just have been a repetition of what is known. Tit for tat was quickly replaced by another strategy. And that other strategy we called generous tit for tat. And generous tit for tat is the following. I start with cooperation, and then if you cooperate, I will cooperate. And if you defect, I will cooperate with a certain probability. So suddenly here we have a recipe for evolution of forgiveness and for saving many marriages in the US. So you could have on the kitchen counter a set of dice and roll them in order to forgive your partner, and the divorce rate would go down dramatically. And so it's important that the level of forgiveness is not too high, because then you can be exploited, and also it's probabilistic, so it cannot really predict it. So this generous tit for tat has this nice feature there. So the world seems happy. We go from this stern retaliator tit for tat, who doesn't know how to forgive, to somebody who knows how to forgive. So everything is sort of on a good trajectory. However, it becomes too good. What happened next was somehow a surprise. But if everybody here plays generous tit for tat, and I'm an unconditional cooperator, then I have no disadvantage. I'm a neutral mutant. In some sense, if there are birds that go to an island without predators, they're not under pressure to maintain their ability to fly, they lose their ability to fly. I lose the ability to retaliate if nobody tries to cheat on me. Neutral drift gets you from generous tit for tat to always cooperate. And once everybody here plays always cooperate, you can predict what will happen next. It goes to always defect. And you have a simple mathematical model of human history and economic cycles and all of this. There is one strategy that can break the cycle for some time, but also not forever, and this is known only to experts in the field. And this strategy is called win-stay-lose shift. And win-stay-lose shift works in the following way. If I'm doing well, then I will repeat my move, and if I'm doing badly, then I will change my move. That's another way to play the game. And by all measures, it's a better way to play the simultaneous repeated prisoner's dilemma than any tit-for-tat-like strategy. But this is known to very few people only. So the world of repeated prisoner's dilemma is by no means over. It's like playing chess. You know, there is no best way to play chess. There is no best strategy for the repeated prisoner's dilemma. People always propose new strategies, either more complicated ones or other variants. But there's one simple rule that holds in this world, which is elegant. And this is that direct reciprocity allows the evolution of cooperation only if the probability of another round is greater than the cost-to-benefit ratio. So you remember in one of the first slides, we had the cost of cooperation and the benefit. This is just one parameter in essence, the cost-to-benefit ratio. If the probability of another round is greater than that parameter, then direct reciprocity has a chance. Otherwise, always the fact is the only possibility. So maybe some of you cooperated in the beginning because you are instinctively thinking about repeated situations. But I think a bigger fraction of you cooperated because of that second mechanism, and this is called indirect reciprocity. Indirect reciprocity is the idea, I help you and somebody will help me. So again, Vincent van Gogh's Good Samaritan here, whatever his motive was, it was not, this is the first round of a repeated prisoner's dilemma and it's better to cooperate here. But I think in many situations we are willing to help people for another reason. And that could be because of reputation. So indirect reciprocity works via reputation. I help somebody and that increases my reputation because others are finding out about it or observing it. Or I don't help somebody and that reduces my reputation. So the idea is that the interaction occurs in the presence of observers. And that changes how I will behave. Because what I do, a short-term cost or a short-term benefit right now, I have to compare that to the long-term loss or gain of reputation. An interesting experiment was done in a lab in England where over the coffee machine, you could voluntarily, I mean, you were supposed to pay whenever you took coffee, and on alternating weeks, they had either a face there or very stylized eyes or just a landscape. And whenever there was something that looked like a face or eyes, there was more in the coffee, in the money case than on the other weeks. So we are aware of observation and we behave accordingly. The experimental confirmation of this idea was also done in experiments with students by Klaus Wedekind and Manfred Milinski, where they showed that people help those who help others and helpful people have a higher payoff in the end. So the idea is that there's an interaction and some observe it and the others spread it by gossip. People are obsessed with talking about others. The typical conversation over coffee is to talk about others, to evaluate the reputation in some sense about others. An experiment was done in British trains where they listened to people's conversation topics. And about 60% was about, in this framework of indirect reciprocity, talking about others, evaluating their reputation. E-trade and internet commerce, to a very large extent, is based on this evaluation of your behavior. We are willing to pay a higher price if the seller has a good reputation. But this gossip brings something very interesting into play, and this is language. So it brings two things into play, social intelligence and language. These games of indirect reciprocity are cognitively demanding. Individuals need to monitor the social network of a group. They have to ask themselves, who does what to whom and why? And that is the right selection pressure for the evolution of social intelligence. But individuals must be able to talk to each other about others, and that's the evolution of human language. So you could argue these early games of cooperation and affection in the context of indirect reciprocity and direct to some extent were really the driving force for the emergence of human language and politics. My friend David Haig at Harvard put it very succinctly. He said, for direct reciprocity, you need a face. For indirect reciprocity, you need a name. And the face, there's very much in a face and in our ability to recognize faces and to remember, I had this interaction with this person and this is what I have to do now. But this is not enough to play indirect reciprocity where we have to be able to talk to each other about others. And here we don't have any clear example, maybe no example from the animal world where that could be possible. So that could be a unique feature of human biology, this unlimited cooperation based on indirect reciprocity. So animals, in order to do indirect reciprocity, really have to observe each other directly. That's the idea. And this world of indirect reciprocity is more complicated than a direct one because a strategy depends on a behavioral rule and an assessment rule in how to evaluate the interaction between other people, but also what to do given the reputation of the other person and possibly my own reputation. But again, a simple rule can be proven, and this rule is that the probability to know someone's reputation has to exceed the cost-to-benefit ratio. Indirect reciprocity works if there is not complete so if people know each other, if people have some chance to actually know about each other's reputation, and that probability has to be greater than the cost-to-benefit ratio. So I come to the third mechanism, which I call spatial selection, and here we'll talk about spatial games, games on graphs, maybe games in phenotype space, games on sets. The idea here is that we are not in a well-mixed population. It is not the case that everybody interacts with everybody else equally likely. Instead, we are in a structure, we are embedded in a social network or in a geographic structure. And there, cooperators can form clusters. And these clusters can prevail in the presence of defectors. The idea here is neighbors help each other. Neighbors help each other can lead to evolution of cooperation. So these early studies with Bob May in Oxford led to this cellular automata and deterministic chaos and kaleidoscopes where we studied cooperators and defectors unfolding on like two-dimensional spatial grids according to deterministic rules. But more recently, we put this into more general population structures, which we call games on graphs, where there is, you can think of a social network, for example, and you interact with your friends and with others. And for every cooperator neighbor that you have, you get a benefit. For every defector neighbor, you have no benefit, but you pay a cost for every neighbor, and all of your neighbors get a benefit if you're a cooperator. And here you can actually show, surprisingly, a very simple rule, and this is that spatial selection on graphs favors cooperation if the benefit to cost ratio is greater than the average number of neighbors. So spatial selection works better if you have a small number of very good friends. It's harder in a very connected big society to rely on this mechanism. Evolutionary set theory is the idea that the structures we have are not constant, but they're changing all the time. So people belong to sets, to certain clubs, to certain departments. They play with people there, and then others observe them, and they imitate payoff, and they want to join sets of successful individuals. Now we have a dynamic social structure where successful sets attract more members. And also there can be a rule proven that this can lead to the evolution of cooperation if the benefit to cost ratio is greater than some combination of the parameters that arise in this setting. And another idea is games in phenotype space, where the idea is that you cooperate with those that are sufficiently similar to you. It's a kind of tag-based cooperation. And that can also lead to a clustering in a space. This time it's a kind of phenotypic space or tag space where cooperators win because they form the cluster. And the fourth mechanism I want to mention is group selection. And here's a beautiful quote from Charles Darwin. There can be no doubt that a tribe, including many members who are always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over other tribes, and this would be natural selection. So he imagines a competition between two tribes, and in one, they help each other, they are sacrificial with respect to each other, and he imagines a competition between them, and then the one where they're more cooperative, they win over the less cooperative one. You can put this into a simple mathematical model where you can say that I play the game with others in the group, offspring are added to the group, groups divide when reaching a certain size, and groups die. And then you can prove that group selection favors cooperators if the benefit to cost ratio is greater than 1 plus, and now a ratio of group size over the number of groups. So group selection works well if the group size is small and if there are many groups. It's harder and harder to work in larger and larger groups and fewer of them. The fifth mechanism I want to mention, and the last one, is kin selection. And here the idea is that interaction occurs between genetic relatives. As G.B.S. Holden said, I will jump into the river to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins. And his idea was that the coefficient of relatedness between brothers is half, between cousins is 1/8. And so that's what he will do there in order to preserve his genes. And Holden was a founding father of population genetics, but he was also politically very active. He was a dedicated communist here, addressing a group of British workers, presumably not talking about kin selection or population genetics. This idea became really famous in the work of Bill Hamilton, and it's related to what is called Hamilton's rule. And Hamilton's rule is the idea, as expressed by Holden on the previous slide, that the coefficient of relatedness has to be greater than the cost-to-benefit ratio. And this is a very celebrated rule in biology, but I have taken some issue with it in a recent paper with Ed Wilson, because it rests on a mathematical approach that is called inclusive fitness theory, and that's, in my opinion, a very problematic approach to do things. And we published a paper in Nature that was on the front cover, and it raised a lot of controversy, but no scientific factual response, where we actually prove that inclusive fitness is a limited concept that you can sometimes use, but not always. So inclusive fitness is the idea that stands behind most of what people call kin selection. I would actually try to define a kin selection that doesn't need inclusive fitness. But right now we are in a situation where kin selection is fully linked to the concept of inclusive fitness. And in that paper we show that it exists in some evolutionary processes, but not in the majority of evolutionary processes. We also show that it is not needed, as was previously thought, to explain the evolution of social insects or any aspect of social evolution. And we also show that a meaningful version of Hamilton's rule, where cost and benefit are really the parameters that we're talking about in the game, and relatedness is really genetic relatedness, almost never holds. You can actually use inclusive fitness theory itself to disprove that version of Hamilton's rule. And instead of inclusive fitness in this paper, we propose a gene-centered approach and a clear mathematical analysis of natural selection. And what I'm saying is that once fitness is calculated, every aspect of relatedness is included. So a normal natural selection analysis does not leave out population structure relatedness, but has it incorporated in the correct way. And the inclusive fitness argument always has the danger of actually incorporating it incorrectly. So if we go back to Holden, what I'm proposing here in this paper is the following idea. Should Holden jump into the river to save his brother, yes or no? The inclusive fitness question would be, does it increase or reduce his inclusive fitness to do this? And the problem is that in most cases, inclusive fitness cannot be calculated, cannot be defined, doesn't even exist as a concept. And so what I propose instead is, the question, the real biological question would be, imagine there's an allele, a gene, a genetic mutant, which makes you jump into the river to save a relative. Is that allele favored or opposed by natural selection? And that's a very precise population genetic-based question, which can be decided, and that doesn't need inclusive fitness. So that analysis is independent of inclusive fitness and gives you the right answer. And that's what the issue of the argument is actually about at the moment. So the 5 mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation: direct reciprocity, I help you, you help me; indirect reciprocity, I help you, somebody helps me; spatial selection, neighbors help each other; group selection, groups of cooperators outcompete other groups; and kin selection would be cooperate with genetic relatives. More precisely, my proposal would be kin selection operates based on kin recognition and conditional behavior. I recognize my brother and behave accordingly. And that definition of kin selection is not used by anybody at the moment because it is so intricately linked up with this flawed mathematical theory, inclusive fitness. So there is no clear theory of kin selection actually out there yet, amazingly, even though it's one of the oldest mechanisms in existence. But coming back to humans, in my opinion, direct and indirect reciprocity are the key components for understanding the evolution of any pro-social behavior in humans. because even if you use group selection to talk about humans, you have to remember that you're talking about small groups where people know each other, where repeated interactions occur. Therefore, you never have a theory of human evolution without direct and indirect reciprocity. Every aspect of human behavior is based on repeated interaction between people and also in a group. But what made us human, in my opinion, is indirect reciprocity because it's selected for social intelligence and for human language. And looking forward, we must learn to harness the cooperation, the cooperative mechanisms that we might have on smaller scales to actually learn to cooperate globally and also to cooperate with future generations. So what I mean, my examples here mostly were based on pairwise interactions between cooperation and defection, but a large part of the literature deals with, and is also encompassed by these mechanisms, with cooperation in a group, where it's not just two people that can cooperate to defect, but a number of people. So the public goods game is an n-person prisoner's dilemma, and that's one challenge, how to get cooperation in a larger group of people. And the even harder problem is then to do it on a global scale. And the even harder problem is that cooperation now will actually benefit or harm future generations. So for example, we can pay a cost now to reduce a luxurious lifestyle such that future generations have a benefit. Or we cannot do this and exactly do the opposite, make more and more debt, for example, and burden that on the future generations. So we are borrowing against the future. And so I think this is the most fundamental problem with respect to human behavior and human global issues at the moment. How to get cooperation operative on a large scale and also on this temporal scale, looking forward with the future. And that idea of the problem, how to cooperate with the future, was nicely explained to me in one context by the British science minister, whom I met in a conference in Cambridge, and he said there was a forest, and people wanted to harbor that forest, to destroy it. And so the one argument against it was, don't cut it down, because the price of wood is going up. It would be better to cut it down later. And interestingly, this wasn't convincing enough. So a second argument was brought, don't cut it down, because people use it as a park for recreation. That didn't carry the day either. Finally, the argument was made, don't cut it down. You have no right to cut it down, because you wouldn't even have that forest if it wasn't left to you from previous generations. Therefore, it's your obligation to leave it to future generations. And this begins to get at this problem that we have to solve, how to cooperate with the future. So here's a list of cooperators with whom I have worked over many years and from whom I have learned very, very much. Thank you so much.
I'm sure that Professor Nowak will be happy to answer a couple of questions if there's someone in the audience. There's a microphone over there.
Hi, excuse me. Sorry, I don't know how loud this is. So do you feel like it's possible for humans or other species of animal to truly be irrational actors?
Irrational or rational?
Irrational.
It's easily possible to be irrational.
Well, but I mean, in terms of your model, is there any way to potentially factor that in, or have you given any thought to maybe in what way that could be represented?
It's the other way around. So this rationality notion of game theory is something very funny. This is like this, this would be the person who picks always the Nash equilibrium no matter how complicated the game is. And most experiments show that people don't do this kind of rationality because usually their intuition comes from a situation where it's not exactly that game that we are playing, but something modified. And there, the cooperation, for example, would be the better outcome in any case. So most people don't behave in this perfectly rational way. And the interesting question of experimental economics and our experimental studies is exactly to define the degree of rationality that people have, but also to explain that with theoretical models.
Thank you very much, sir.
Hi, thank you very much. I feel like you've just summed up the philosophy of my life, so that's amazing. I have a question as to whether or not you, what you think about the possibility of all of the other species that live on this planet, whether or not they might cooperate with each other to rid themselves of another species that is harming them.
Yeah, so you can look at infectious diseases, for example, and if one species becomes very, very successful, it becomes a bigger and bigger target for new infectious agents to come in. So in some sense, the natural selection in biology is taking care of those who become too successful. The question is whether the ingenuity of the winners kind of can keep up with that.
Do you have any thoughts on how we could help Congress learn how to cooperate?
I think what is already in place are reputational systems. And I think this, to augment those reputational systems, should definitely help to lead to a certain cooperation.
Could you just discuss about upstream indirect reciprocity? Like,
so
to
upstream
cooperate.
reciprocity is the idea that you do something nice to me, and then I'm in a very good mood, and I do something nice to somebody else. That's upstream reciprocity. It's also called pay it forward, I believe. So actually, it happened to me. The first time I ever came to the US, I had a rental car, and then suddenly on the motorway, I was stuck with a structure that I'd never seen before in my life, and it was like a toll booth. And I didn't know what to do. And as I was trying to figure out what this object was, the person behind me jumped out of his car and paid for me. And so then it would be that I'm so happy that I would pay for somebody else, but in this case, that I was just happy. But and so the question is, why do people do that?
Yeah.
And that's not easy to explain. So that's not one of the mechanisms. It needs a mechanism to actually explain that behavior. Okay. And the mechanism that could be there is sometimes, for example, somebody who does something nice to me, I do it back to that person immediately, or later I might meet that person and it comes back to me in this sense, or it has to do with reputation or with spatial structures.
Thanks a lot.
So I have a question about spatial structure. So this seems to have to do with who we know in a social network. And I wonder what you think about how, as our social networks change, as modern technology changes the way we communicate with people we know and our neighbors, how this changes our ability to coordinate or cooperate at good equilibria.
Yeah, I think as the social network becomes bigger and bigger and more connected, that mechanism just to cooperate because of the spatial structure, because of this idea, help your neighbor, becomes weaker and weaker. And that is then harder to achieve. So this local cooperation is easier in a smaller place where you just know your neighbors than in an anonymous place where you don't even know your neighbors. But the other mechanism that can become more powerful is the indirect reciprocity one, because the modern media give us more opportunity to actually pay attention to reputation.
If not, I would like to thank Professor Nowak again. And thank you.